I'm Jim Granado, Dean of the Hobby School of Public Affairs. Today we have a very distinguished guest, Ambassador Chase Untermeyer. Ambassador Untermeyer, before we go to the Q&A. He has been the United States Ambassador to Qatar from 2004 to 2007 on the appointment of President George W. Bush. He is a 1968 graduate of Harvard College, where I come from, we call Harvard University, with honors in government. He served during the Vietnam War as an officer in the United States Navy aboard a destroyer in the Western Pacific and as an aide to the commander of U.S. naval forces in the Philippines. Upon his return to Texas, Ambassador Untermeyer was a political reporter for the Houston Chronicle and a member of the Texas House of Representatives elected for a district in Houston. He left the Texas legislature in 1981 to go to Washington, D.C. as executive assistant to then Vice President Bush. 3 years later, President Reagan appointed him Assistant Secretary of the Navy for Manpower and Reserve Affairs. Part of that time was a massive buildup in our U.S. Navy, which Ambassador Untermeyer was part of. When George Bush became president in 1989, Ambassador Untermeyer returned to the White House as Director of Presidential Personnel, and in 1990 was appointed Director of the Voice of America. He's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. He's the author of 3 volumes of diary-based memoirs of the Reagan and Bush administrations, first Bush administration, I might add. And last but not least, he is the Hobby School's first professor of practice. Ambassador Untermeyer, welcome.
Thank you, Jim. Good to be here in another new capacity with the Hobby School.
To our audience members, let me add that if you have a question, please use the Q&A function on Zoom. We'll get to your questions, we'll get to as many of your questions as possible. So let's start. We have many students and young professionals tuning in our discussion right now. Let's start this discussion with a review of your early career. How'd you get started in politics and government?
It began very early because I was a reader of American politics and history. As early as age 8, I became a fan of Theodore Roosevelt, a very good idol to have. And I couldn't help but notice that he was able to do the things he did because he was a politician. He ran for office, lost a time or two, but eventually got to the top and was able to do amazing things. And that naturally sparked a desire in me to try to do those kinds of things myself, and politics was a pathway there. Later, when I was in high school, I got more directly involved in politics, meaning by working in campaigns. And that led in my college years to working in the campaign of a young Houston oil man named George H.W. Bush, who was just known as George Bush in those days. And when he got elected to Congress, I was able to go to Washington as an intern. And after that, many of the things you mentioned in the introduction came to happen.
So you graduated from high school, what part of Texas? You're Texas native, correct?
Yes, I grew up in the Memorial Drive area of Houston and went through the Spring Branch public schools from kindergarten through high school.
And I assume you graduated near the top of your class and you had interest in politics at that point, which you've described. So you chose to go to Harvard. I mean, I guess one of the questions would be, maybe it's too obvious, but why did you choose Harvard over some other places? Obviously, you get into Harvard, you get a lot of other places too.
Well, back then, and we're talking about the mid-60s, it was more obvious that somebody interested in government, politics, history should go to a big, usually Ivy League school, because they, Harvard being a good example, at the time, had the faculties, the libraries, the reputation, the wealth to be able to be leaders in the fields I was interested in. A very positive development in American life that's happened in that subsequent 60-year period is the development of very strong programs and faculties and libraries in a wide variety of institutions, public and private. The Hobby School is just a good example. Maybe if I were a high school student today, or in fact, I'd say definitely if I was a high school student today, I'd welcome the full range of options for study that would be close to home. Of course, there's the Hobby School very close to home, but we can't forget the honorable competition, the Bush School at A&M, the Tower Center at SMU. There's the James Baker Institute at Rice, and that's just Texas.
Right. So you're at Harvard. Were you drafted into the Navy, or were you ROTC?
I joined the ROTC. This was the heart of the Vietnam War period, when there was a draft that affected all men who may have had student deferments, and those student deferments were only good during the undergraduate years. Once a guy had graduated, they might go to law school or medical school or some other kind of grad school, but they didn't have a guaranteed deferment. And I frankly wanted to take control of my own future. And I figured the best way to do it would be to join. And I did that not just out of desire to evade the draft, but because I knew from reading political history that many successful politicians, particularly those in the post-war period, had had military service at some point. I figured that the Vietnam War was my generation's war, that I needed to be in it. Both my parents, incidentally, had been veterans of World War II. My father was an Army officer. My mother was one of the first women naval officers. So I figured this was my time. And also I figured that it would be valuable in a career that I hoped would embrace national office, to have some knowledge of what the military was like. And that undoubtedly was valuable.
So your mom, so obviously we know about the wax because of Ovita Kolpabi's involvement with that at the outset, but your mom was a wave. Is that what
That's correct? She was in the very first class of women wave officers. Today they are not separated out by gender, but she was definitely one of the first. They were trained at Smith College in Massachusetts during the winter of 1942-43, and given assignments upon graduation, my mother went to the what was called Old Main Navy, the Navy Department headquarters on the Mall in Washington. And that's where, in the city of Washington, she met my father.
And your father, he served in Europe, I assume, if he was in the Army, is that correct?
He mostly served in Washington because he was involved in the Lend-Lease program, which provided military assistance to our allies. Toward the very end of the war, he did get assigned to London, where a lot of that was handled, but he was never in combat.
Well, that's interesting. So he's involved with Lend-Lease, which was a very tricky operation for President Roosevelt at the time, correct? Because we were technically neutral, and he was trying to figure ways to assist the British, who were, by all intents and purposes, getting the heck beat out of them at that time. So
that was definitely the origin of Lend-Lease. My father joined the Army after Pearl Harbor, which meant after all that was no longer a touchy issue. The American people were fully behind giving aid to our allies.
So you're in college, and so I assume you weren't in intern programs while you were at Harvard. You just went straight into the military. Is that right? Or do you have other access to things that got you interested in public service while you're at the university? Yes,
one benefit of being at Harvard, I have to say, is that it was a short subway ride from Boston. Boston, of course, is the state capital of Massachusetts. And I was a volunteer for a member of the Massachusetts House of Representatives, who had no staff, no office. Therefore, as a student volunteer, I got to do a lot of legislative work on behalf of this member, which was very, very valuable, especially given the fact that about 10 years later, I was a state representative myself. And then, as I mentioned, I was an intern for freshman Congressman Bush in the summer between my junior and senior year, and also for a few weeks after I graduated and before I went on active duty with the Navy.
So you got your degree in government, but you wind up, when you muster out of the Navy, you wind up becoming a journalist. What drove you to becoming a journalist?
Once again, it was politics. I was fully aware that the typical pathway for people into politics is to go to law school. I was never motivated to spend 3 years in law school. I'm not sure I would have been very successful, but what I did do was to be, for 3 years, a newspaper reporter. When I came back from naval service, and that included service overseas, followed by about a year and a half of travel overseas. When I came back to Houston, I needed a job not only to pay for groceries, but also to help me learn about the city where I hope to get involved in civic and public affairs. Being a newspaper reporter was a wonderful means of doing that. Now, I should say that I had never been involved in journalism, not in my high school or college newspapers, but the Chronicle was willing to take a bet on me and hired me without that kind of experience. I should note that if I had gone to the other newspaper in the city at the time, the Houston Post, owned by the Hobby family, I probably would not have gotten past the receptionist, because the Post had very high standards, or at least higher than the Chronicles when it came to reporters. They had to have had prior journalistic experience, at the very least on the campus level, and preferably in a smaller newspaper someplace else.
You're a journalist at the Houston Chronicle. You're going to run for elective office. When did you decide you wanted to do that? And what was the process to do that?
Well, it should be mentioned that it's very unusual in American politics for a practicing journalist to run for office. It's much more common in Great Britain, where, for example, the current Prime Minister of Great Britain, Boris Johnson, was a practicing journalist. But in American context, admirably so, journalists have a feeling of separation from, and I might even say superiority over, practicing politicians. So that was unusual. But for me, it was valuable because I was paid to learn things, to meet people, and get to be known by people in the political community. Going, however, from the newsroom into being a politician was a bit tricky. And for me, the perfect way station was that while I was the political reporter at the Chronicle, a young engineer named John Lindsay was elected the first Republican county judge of Harris County. This was 1974, back before the Republican Party had any significance and number of elected officials. He was elected largely because the voters of Harris County were upset with the incumbent, and he happened to be the alternative. He got elected. He had no prior government experience. I got the idea that what he needed was somebody with a little bit more knowledge than he had at the time about how things work. And I asked him if I could go to work for him, and perhaps groggy from having stayed up all night on election night, he agreed. And I was therefore his executive assistant for the first 1.5 years of what became for him a 20-year career as county judge of Harris County. And that proved to be an ideal jumping off place when a seat opened up in the Texas House.
And you sought election what year?
That would be 1976.
Okay.
I was reelected in both 1978 and 1980, but 1980 was when Reagan and Bush were elected, and that's when I left the legislature to go to Washington.
So while you're going through this process in the mid-70s, when did you first meet George H.W. Bush?
I first met him in that 1966 campaign for Congress, and that's a story unto itself. But thanks to having met him, he did ask me to become an intern, and that allowed me to get to Washington to absorb the intoxicating atmosphere of the US Capitol. And one nature about the Bush family, especially George H.W. Bush, is that they never forgot people who they considered friends and helpers. So I was able to maintain that relationship in later years.
So you've been reelected now to this Texas State House, but Reagan is elected, President and Vice President Bush is his running mate, and you get a call to do what?
Well, first of all, advice to people who are interested in joining a presidential administration someday is don't just sit by the phone waiting for a call. You have to take action on your own. You have to have a plan A and probably a plan B and a plan C. In my case, I was conflicted because I had been reelected to the Texas House to a third term. The voters, in effect, expected me to go work for them again. And I didn't want to just walk away, even if given a great opportunity to serve. But I'm glad to say the conflict was resolved in favor of going to Washington. The voters proceeded to choose a very able man named Ashley Smith to succeed me, and therefore they were not bad off in the long term. And I had a chance then to go do what I'd always wanted to do, which is to operate out of not just Washington, but the very famous West Wing of the White House.
So you're executive assistant to Vice President Bush, correct?
Yes.
What's that like? I mean, my guess is you don't sleep very much.
Well, what we did a great deal of was travel. And that's because George Bush was very, very physically active. And he very much wanted to be everywhere that would help the new president. And that meant that in the year and a half, excuse me, more like 2 years that I worked for him, I made a total of 99 trips. And that was to practically every state, and it was to every populated continent. If you do the math, that means that we were traveling somewhere at least once a week. But as a practical matter, it was often 2 or 3 times a week. And foreign trips would last sometimes as long as 2 or 3 weeks altogether. So I was not married at the time. I'm not sure anybody on the staff could have been married and have a normal family life given the amount of travel that we did.
But you're just I want to just talk about the workload. So you arrive at the office at what, 6 a.m.?
Not quite that early, more like 7:30.
Okay, and you go home at 8?
Usually, that's very true.
And then you've got to be by the phone just in case, right? I mean, we didn't have cell phones and things back then, right? To the extent we had those cordless phones, they were these monstrosities, looked like a walkie-talkie, cost thousands of dollars. So those really weren't around. So you had to be near something at all times, is my guess.
Yes, an old-fashioned landline phone. Now, because of my status, the White House installed a special telephone that, of course, they paid for. I didn't have to pay for. You know, in those days, people could not own a telephone. You rented it from the telephone company. And that was why I got my own special phone that I didn't have to pay for, but was immediately connected to the White House operator and to the parallel communication system that the US Army runs.
I would like to get into this a little bit. Among your trips, I mean, you've made history and you've witnessed history. One of your trips in, I think, March of 1981, you've only been on the job for a couple months. Ronald Reagan there's an attempted assassination on our way. In fact, he's hurt very badly. And you're on a trip to Austin, Texas, correct?
Yes, it was Vice President Bush's first trip back to Texas since becoming vice president. The trip began in Fort Worth, where he gave a speech to the Southwest Texas Cattle Raisers Association in behalf of Reagan's economic program. And then he proceeded to Austin to give a speech to a joint session of the legislature. Only as the plane was lifting off from Carswell Air Force Base in Fort Worth, the word was flashed about the attempt on President Reagan. And what that meant as a practical matter, once more details came out during the course of that roughly half-hour flight, was that the joint session of the legislature was canceled. The stop in Austin was merely to refuel Air Force Two and then return to Washington.
So Vice President Bush is on the phone then with the people are meeting in the cabinet officers who are there at the White House, right? Because we've heard about the famous press conference where Al Haig's I'm in control here, but behind the scenes, you had Caspar Weinberger, Al Haig, I mean, a variety of people were there, and Vice President Bush is on his way. So is he in direct contact with him on the phone on Air Force Two to start talking about some issues, or you have
Yes,
to wait till he landed?
yes, there was definitely ground to air communication. Let's not forget our fellow Houstonian, James Baker, who was then
Yeah.
Ronald Reagan's chief of staff. He had been George Bush's campaign manager, and to the shock of many longtime supporters of Ronald Reagan, Baker was chosen to be the White House chief of staff, which was a very deft move on the part
Yes,
of
it was.
President Reagan. And it was also very helpful to George Bush, his very close friend, former tennis partner, who could count on him to have support in that very critical precinct known as the White House staff.
Yeah, there was a book a few years ago on chiefs of staff, which is a relatively new position in the White House. It's been around, I don't know, 50 years, people argue roughly. But they say the heavyweight champion of that position was James Baker. So yes, I mean, Ronald Reagan benefited enormously from that.
Yes, well, a recent biography of Baker is subtitled or it's called "The Man Who Ran Washington."
So you're executive assistant, and then you're promoted to work in the Naval Department, correct?
Yes, a word needs to be said, and that is the job working for Vice President Bush was undoubtedly glamorous. It was exactly what I'd always wanted to go to Washington to do, to have an office, even a tiny office in the West Wing of the White House, just a 15-second walk from the Oval Office, to be in that very high level atmosphere where people around the office were headliners, where we would get on airplanes and fly all over the world and meet notable people, both Americans and foreign leaders. I have many a bragging right of names to drop of people I met during that period. But so people might think it's strange that I was restless in a job like that. But the truth was that I recognized, as I learned more about how things really work in Washington, that the White House really does not run the government. Now, we know that the president's the head of the executive branch, and all the people on the White House staff are helping the president do that. But because the federal government is so enormous, that the real day-to-day governing is done by people in the departments and agencies of the government whom the president has appointed. And I realized that if I wanted to find out how things really work, I would have to leave this magnificent, exciting, but very unreal world of the West Wing of the White House and go be in the heart of the bureaucracy in some department and agency. And the place I wanted to go, the place I was able to go, was the Navy Department, which then and now is a component of the Department of Defense. Because I'd been in the Navy and had my special naval heritage, namely my mother, it was a natural place that I wanted to be. And it was the center of a great deal of activity during that administration in so far as building up America's defenses were concerned.
And my recollection is that when President Reagan was elected, one of his goals was a 750 ship Navy. And I think John
600
Lemon
actually was the number.
600?
Yes,
And then
we got close, but not quite to 600.
And John Lehman was the Secretary of the Navy at that time, correct?
Yes, he was my boss, a most brilliant and capable individual. In fact, I've called him probably the most successful political executive since World War II. He had the experience, the brain power, and the knack of being able to get things done in Washington that was unparalleled. Therefore, the rebuilding of the Navy, ships and submarines and aircraft and weapon systems, was very much his doing. Now, there would have been movement in that direction with another person as Secretary of the Navy, but he was able to accomplish so much more and to do it in a faster way than other people might have been.
So you served in the Naval Department until 1991, is that correct?
actually to 1988, which was
1988?
the year that Vice President Bush
Right.
ran for president.
So you were, okay, and then you become, you work, you're the director of presidential personnel then. Is that what the job you took on?
There was another way station in that I was the transition planner for Vice President Bush. Having been working for him in the White House and then 5 years at the Pentagon, it seemed to me that the real skill that I could bring to his operation was not political, was not getting delegates and votes and campaign contributions, but to actually think about what he would do if he was elected and what that so-called transition period from between the election and the inauguration would be like. So I did that planning. And when he was elected in 1988, I was among his very first appointees designated to be in charge of personnel. And that elided past the inauguration into being with the title Assistant to the President for Presidential Personnel.
So does that position involve actually helping recruit cabinet level individuals as well?
And so much more. Now,
Okay.
presidents, as a rule, are the primary personnel officer when it comes to the cabinet, although that is more obviously so for some of the very biggest jobs, Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, Attorney General, et cetera. Some of the lesser cabinet offices may be left to the personnel director. And so I can count on one hand the number of cabinet officers that I personally either suggested or recruited. But the real job for personnel office in any administration, including the current one, is in filling out all the other ranks that a president has to name, the so-called sub-cabinet. These are people with titles like deputy secretary, undersecretary, assistant secretary. Now, to the untutored ear, all those things might sound like about the same thing, but anybody who's been in the bureaucracy in Washington knows exactly how a deputy secretary outranks an undersecretary and an undersecretary outranks an assistant secretary. All those are presidential appointments that require confirmation of the Senate, which adds another degree of excitement. But that was not enough just to deal with the cabinet departments. There were independent agencies, there were the regulatory commissions, there were the ambassadorships, the US attorney positions, and federal judges in general, which was a task that I shared with the White House counsel, that is the president's lawyer, in choosing the people who are appointed to lifetime tenure jobs in the federal judiciary, so-called Article 3 judges. But the White House counsel of the day let me handle what are called Article 1 judges. And those are set up by the Congress. That's what the Article 1 refers to, for specific kinds of judgeships dealing with taxes, federal claims, veterans appeals, et cetera. And so I had a hand in picking those judges primarily.
So one of the challenges in picking personnel is the rivalries involved, that screening people so they'll be good. Team player can be a very dangerous word, but someone just gets along with everybody and makes their point, but are not destructive. And one of the things about the President Bush's foreign policy team that is, when historians talk about, it was one of the most well-run group, I mean, in terms of getting along and on point. I mean, you had Brent Scowcroft, James Baker, Dick Cheney, and of course you could round it off with you could talk about Colin Powell's over there, Joint Chiefs. But the first Gulf War, a stunning success. But when you read about how they, and also the collapse of the Soviet Union, dealing with Tiananmen Square, all these things that this group, and the question I guess is, was this more about President Bush? He knew these gentlemen and he said, these guys are going to be, I know they'll get along, and they're going to argue, but they're not going to be destructive and do things that would undermine the mission for the country.
Yes, I claim zero, in fact, minus zero credit for that team. That was entirely George Bush's construct. As you said, they had known each other for years, going back to the Nixon and Ford administration. This is true, incidentally, in any administration where younger people serving in mid-level or maybe almost high-level jobs get to get experience in one administration, and then when their party is back in power 4, 8 or more years later, they can take some of the most senior positions. And we were benefited as a country in that the people you mentioned, George Bush, James Baker, Dick Cheney, Brent Scowcroft, had all worked together cooperatively and harmoniously in the past. They were genuine friends, and that didn't prevent conflict, but it meant that any conflict that occurred between agencies or different points of view could be reconciled through the process of friendship and of discussion. If there were any tensions, that's where the president came in. He was a man who, in the end of the day, had the experience and the knowledge and the personal skills to make conflict, to resolve conflict. And usually that's because he made the decision, and the other people in that group that we just talked about got together and agreed to carry out his will.
So when you transition out of upon President Bush's defeat, you wind up having an appointment to the Council on Foreign Relations, among other things. How did that come about?
Well, the Council on Foreign Relations, a private organization, I didn't join until much later. That is, after I was an ambassador. So during the first Bush administration, I not only was not a member, I could not have become a member because anybody in a senior level position, particularly requiring confirmation of the Senate, cannot belong to any private group or association. You have to resign from all those entities. And that's how it was when I was appointed to head the Voice of America, which is the overseas broadcasting arm of the US government.
So if we fast forward to the George W. Bush's administration, you become ambassador to Qatar. What led up to that appointment?
Well, I'm sorry to say the first step was the defeat of the first President Bush in the 1992 election by Bill Clinton. It was a blow at the time, still something to be regretted because the foreign policy success of the United States that we've been discussing essentially halted while Clinton assembled his own team and picked up the reins of government. But that's what the voters decided, and a personal benefit of that, even though it was painful, was returning to Texas. And I returned to Texas in 1993, which was the eve of the coming of George W. Bush as governor. He was elected the next year, 1994. I had known him through my knowledge of his family over many years. And not immediately, but eventually he asked me to help his administration in Texas by becoming chairman of the State Board of Education, a very controversial body. I was appointed to the board and designated chairman. Later, I put my name on the ballot. It's an elected position, and was elected without opposition in the year 2000. He was elected, of course, in 2000 as president, went off to Washington. And it was a few years later, at the start of his fourth year as president, that I got the call from the White House about becoming an ambassador.
What does the work of an ambassador involve?
The glamorous notion of ambassadors is not wrong in the sense that, yes, they are designated by their countries to be the senior most representative to that other country. And that involves dealing with the ruler of the country, be it elected or hereditary ruler, and the people in that country's foreign policy establishment, primarily the foreign minister, the equivalent of our Secretary of State. But the job of an ambassador is much, much bigger. In fact, ambassador is really just a title the job that I had, according to my payroll at the State Department, was to be chief of mission in Qatar. The mission was the US Embassy, and the mission is made up of more than just State Department people. It's made up of people from other federal agencies, notably in the case of Qatar, the Defense Department, the Justice Department, meaning the FBI, and the Commerce Department, dealing with promotion of American business. So the job of an ambassador in any country at any time is this two-level where you represent the country externally, but internally, inside the embassy, there's a big management job. Just as we were saying, it was important for President Bush to get his Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense and National Security Advisor and others on the same program. So our chief of mission has to get the country team working together. The State Department people and the Defense Department people and people from other agencies to make sure that they're all working together. And that's a management challenge I was happy to take on. And frankly, having been in the bureaucracy myself and having worked in the White House a couple of times, it was something I was able to do more easily perhaps than other so-called political or non-career appointees.
And the time you served too was, the second Gulf War is going on. And so your job was actually much, in Qatar, of course, is a place where we do have a presence, a military presence, if I'm not mistaken. So you had enhanced duties besides, we had hot war going on. So besides being chief of mission, you've got this other issue where dealing with diplomatic things involving, our allies. Is that correct?
Yes, then as now, there is a major air base called Al Udeid that the US government is able to use. Qatar, as a significant ally of the United States, has allowed American forces and allied forces going back to that war to use its facilities. Now, I did not command the military people. They were very much on their own, but I viewed it as my duty to help facilitate their particular needs, to keep a friendly military to military relationship going, which was troubled, I should say, by the fact that another aspect of Qatar then as now is that it owns and operates Al Jazeera, the Arabic language television network.
Yes.
The reporting of Al Jazeera was to a degree critical to highly critical of American involvement in Iraq. And that upset my administration to the point that they instructed me to, quote, do something, end quote, about Al Jazeera. Now, I can't say exactly all that I did because it's classified, but it did involve engaging with Al Jazeera, something I could do because I had been the director of the Voice of America, another international broadcaster, and at one point a practicing reporter. So I was able to engage with them with the help of the Qatari government, and to the degree that the comments regarding the war in Iraq got better, it was not because they became more pro-American, but because the reporting became more like that of other international broadcasters, like the BBC or CNN or other entities we could name. That was a very valuable thing to do to try to maintain a good relationship between the US and Qatar, given how vital that airbase was to our prosecution of two wars.
So you had experience at various levels of government. Which one did you like the most? Which one did you like the least?
Well, least would only be relative because I feel like every level of government that I've had a chance to serve in, which is all four levels, local, state, national, international, every one of them was valuable and enjoyable. Starting with the very first, I still think very fondly and nostalgically of the time I spent in the Harris County Courthouse. That was such a wonderful place to be, almost a family atmosphere. Amazing thing to say about the third largest county, but that's the nature of county government. And the people I met there and the things we did were very valuable. So it may be the lowest on that 4-level of service, but not in any way the least favorite. But I could certainly say that of the full-time appointments that I had, it's sort of a toss-up between being an assistant secretary of the Navy in that very exciting period, dealing with the Navy and Marine Corps and some very fascinating issues and tempestuous personalities. All of that was spectacular. When I could break away from Washington and go out to visit the fleet, to me as a one-time sailor, it was wonderful to be on board some of our ships, including some of one of the World War II battleships that was recommissioned during the 1980s. They're now museums, but at that time they were operating naval vessels, and a great thrill to be on board the battleship Iowa, also aircraft carriers underway and launching and recovering aircraft. All that was spectacular. Going down on submarine trials. That wasn't just a matter of being a high-level tourist. It was valuable for me to be on operating vessels so I could do my job as the personnel chief at the Navy, to find out what was on the minds of sailors and chief petty officers and junior officers. And in addition to that, the other towering experience was being an ambassador, particularly in the country to which I was assigned at a very important time in the heart of war.
Students interested in a career like yours, spanning all the things you've done, is there a level of government that you recommend they start their career with?
They should not neglect starting at the local level. As I mentioned a moment ago, there's a lot to be learned and a rich satisfaction that comes by being involved in local government and to only a slightly lesser degree state government. And I say that because those are the levels of government where things happen much more easily and quickly than they do at the federal level. The federal level has its power, its scope, its glamour, but as we know, it doesn't always move ahead. And that is true at a congressional level, of course, but it's also true within a bureaucracy. Doesn't matter if it's the military bureaucracy called the Defense Department or a purely domestic bureaucracy like the housing and urban development or transportation. There's a lot to be learned. There's a lot that can be done by people who are willing to learn how to work the system. And it's one of the reasons why I go back to praising the service I did at the Harris County Courthouse in that intensely personal way of government, which is county government in Texas. You learn lessons that apply in Washington, D.C. It's a different level, of course, but in practical terms, human relations terms, it's pretty much the same work. And that's why if people have a chance to start at the top and go to Washington, then they should, of course. And I applaud that achievement. But if their options are more homegrown, then do that.
So you, as you said earlier, you didn't take the law degree route to getting to politics, which is common. You took the journalism route, which is, as you said, in the United States is less common. How did being a journalist affect your abilities as a public servant?
The number one benefit of having been a working reporter was understanding how the press works and how the press thinks and knowing people in the press. That to me was the all-time benefit of having been a journalist. Once again, I went into that line of work not because I was a journalist by orientation or prior experience, but as a pathway to politics. And it served that purpose, but it also enriched my appreciation of what's called the fourth estate. And a word or two, I should say, about being a lawyer. From my experience, not as a lawyer, but watching the practice of law and the process of progress of friends of mine who are lawyers, I can say that it isn't necessary to be a lawyer in order to be involved in government. In my life, I have helped pass law, execute law, interpret law without a law degree. Now, part of that is because it's really a question of judgment and experience and other things, not specifically related to statute, but to the degree decision-making depends upon a knowledge of statute. A non-lawyer can read the law as easily as a lawyer, but to the degree you need a trained legal mind to help, there are plenty of lawyers on tap to provide that advice and assistance. That's what I had at the Navy Department when I had virtually total responsibility and authority over court-martial cases. Now, I'd not been a lawyer, definitely not been a defense attorney or a prosecuting attorney, but I had to be the judge in all kinds of very difficult court-martial cases that were appealed up to the level of the Navy Secretariat. That, at the end of the day, required the application of my judgment, but I was aided by having very skilled Naval and Marine JAG officers, Judge Advocate General Corps officers, who had that knowledge. The final word is that I really believe that the overall advantage of being a lawyer in politics has nothing to do with being a government executive and making those decisions. It has everything to do with an income that the politician may very desperately need when out of office, a shingle to hang up and to get a source of revenue. That is very much the case for the young lawyers who typically are members of our state legislature. They spend their time as legislators in Austin, but when the legislature is not in session, you'll see them in the courthouse taking cases that help pay the bills.
I want to stick with this idea. You're talking about understanding the press because you were part of the press. You were part of the press yourself. One of the things that's always intrigued me is there's definitely a difference in skill with the press conference. Are there a set of rules or a piece of advice you could give to people that someday may be serving as a public official? What are the things you do that make you more effective in the press conference? What are the things you shouldn't do that make you, distract from your message, basically?
Well, there's the old saying, never get into a fight with somebody who buys ink by the barrel. That's another way of saying that the press has the last word. And it can be the word you want or the word you don't want, but they do have the last word. So therefore, for the public official's point of view, you try to make the case for your position or to explain what happened or what went wrong, all those kinds of crisis communications. But at the end of the day, it's what the reporter chooses to say, and you have no power other than maybe a protest to react to that kind of action. It's also wise from the point of view of the public official to know that when asked a question, there are really only about 3 different ways you can answer the question. Number 1 is, I know the answer and I'm going to tell you. Number 2 is, I know the answer and I can't tell you. Or number 3, I don't know. And there are politicians who try to somehow dance around those 3 options, but those are about the only 3 ways to answer a question. Reporters will not like the fact that you choose number 2, that is, I know and I can't tell you, and they'll try to shake it out of you otherwise, but at least they recognize that that is the responsibility of the government official, is to withhold information for cause when necessary, such as in a case of national security.
I mean, one thing I think, and I'm sure you saw that, well, you know better than I, but President Bush, 41, he had very good relationships, personal relationship with the members of the press who didn't agree with him. I'm thinking of editors like, columnists of the New York Times, for example. And it just, I guess that might be one way. That kind of idea is that if you get to know someone on a personal level, that may lessen the venom that comes your way. Maybe not, but it just seems like there was evidently he would send notes to somebody and say that was a little harsh or something like that, things like that, which are kind of tongue in cheek. But it seems to me that, I mean, you watched how he operated, so it seemed to me that he, obviously he was frustrated, but it seemed to me he had a pretty good relationship with most of the press, given the fact that he was a Republican in a profession that tends to lean Democratic.
He did have very good relations with a number of reporters, which didn't in any way insulate him from criticism or unflattering news coverage. That definitely came. But he recognized, as the last too few people recognize in Washington today, that there's always a tomorrow. And in that tomorrow, you'll need friends and you'll need allies and you'll need the credibility that comes from being fair and diligent in what you do.
Another issue you hear people talk about, and there's a concern about this, is should people be discouraged about public life in America today? That is, the willingness to serve, or just in general, the atmosphere seems to be quite toxic. And although you can purchase clarity with the passage of time, so there have been other toxic episodes in our history. And the question is, do you see this as something that's things are breaking apart, or is just like things will settle down at some point? I mean, what is your view on all that's going on right now? The atmosphere.
This is a highly tumultuous and discouraging time, but I would encourage people, particularly younger people who have maybe the same degree of fascination about serving at levels of government that I once did, that the only solution to such troubles is involvement, is engagement, is playing the game. And that requires good people to get involved. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy that if good people take themselves out of government and politics because they are discouraged or predisposed toward disliking it, then we'll get the second or third rate individuals, people who are in it for less healthy reasons, such as just power or having a title. So American history is full of times much, much worse than these. I mean, think of the pre-Civil War period with the battles over slavery, the existence of slavery, the very bloody episodes that led up to the Civil War itself, such as in Kansas and Harper's Ferry and on various plantations where slaves attempted to revolt. All that tore at the fabric of America and of course led to our greatest tragedy, the Civil War. But we got past that and we got better as a country. In fact, the history of America, this is truly which makes us an exceptional country, is replete with examples of America mending its problems and moving on. Now, the number of problems continue and are vexing, but they are subject to repair and even repeal if good people get in the game and do what is effective in terms of achieving progress on legislation or executive action. I should say that the fact that Americans are fighting each other now is a result of one thing. It's not the result of a structure of government. It's not the result of media necessarily. It's because it all involves people. People are often the problem in terms of what's wrong with anything. And what people can mess up, people can correct if people are of a mind to do so. And that is the challenge for the rising generation, is to want to make those changes and to be persuasive and effective with the public and with their colleagues in government in getting those changes accomplished.
Related to this issue, the people that are interested in a career like yours, do you think it's harder today than it was when you started?
Well, it's never easy. There are probably opportunities that exist now that didn't exist in my time that would make it easier. There are greater challenges, but we all have to live in the times we are given. We have no option other than that. And that's why I say nobody should be encouraged. They should feel excited about the opportunities that do exist. Now, perhaps if I were starting out today, it would be harder for me personally to win a Republican primary than it was back in the 1970s. That may be the facts or the case, but there are plenty of others who are very capable, more capable, who could win those races and accomplish more once in public office.
Last question. Looking back on your career, is there anything you wish you had done differently?
Oh, there are thoughts that if I had been perhaps a little bit more bold, that I might have been more successful as a politician and gotten elected to higher office, such as member of Congress. Looking back, you can always see those things much more clearly than you do at the time. But I really can't complain. But I will say that often that self-restraint, that self-criticism before making a decision is often a very poisonous disease to have inflicted on yourself. So people should, who want to get involved in politics and government, should be perhaps bolder than I was and more self-confident than I was in looking ahead and taking advantage of opportunities. So I cannot complain about the things I did not do, because I was able to do a lot of things that would have excited my dreams and imagination when I was a teenager or a college student. So this is not a complaint, but it is a thought that I have from time to time of how much better or different things would have been if I had acted a bit more courageously.
Right. Well, I want to thank you for the conversation today. As for our audience, mark your calendars for our next hobby hour on March 3rd at noon. We're going to have a great conversation about the March primary and the results of the March primary. And then we're going to talk also about President Biden's first year in office. The guests then will be Dick Murray, Renee Cross, Mark Jones, and Michael Adams. Be sure to follow the Hobby School on social media for more information. Again, I want to thank Ambassador Chase Untermeyer for this conversation. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Jim. The same for me.
Take care.